Today is the 13th Sunday of Ordinary Time. Our text is Matthew chapter 10, verses 37 through 42. It's part of a chapter in which we have some rather difficult teachings of Jesus, hard sayings, we might say. It's sometimes called the apostolic discourse. It begins with the choosing of the 12, warnings of persecution, take courage, don't lose heart, make your choices, the stakes are high. And then it concludes with some words of encouragement. Now, every text has a context. Whether that text is literally the written word, such as we have with the Gospels, or the text of life, events, people, things. We cannot understand any text, whether it's literally a written word or a person, event, or thing, unless we understand the context. One of the dangers in looking back, especially 2,000 years, is that we make our assessments on the basis of hindsight. We don't allow for the context of the time. So these hard sayings of Jesus can only be understood if we have some appreciation of the kinds of social, cultural, historical moods, events, processes, threats within which these words were written, within which the hearers were hearing these words. First thing to note is that in the first century before the Common Era, Rome was already very active in this area of what we would call the Middle East, Palestine. In the year 6 before the Common Era, Rome claimed Judea as a Roman province. We would call it annexation. They just moved in by force of power and threat, took it over. There followed many examples of individuals and small groups expressing their resentment to this oppression. We must have some sympathy for it. However, the Romans had no sympathy for that, because the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, the peace of the empire, that things would flow well, was absolute. Anyone who threatened or anyone who upset the Pax Romana was summarily dealt with. Crucifixion was a common punishment. In the year 66 of the Common Era, a group of Jews known as Zealots rose up, rebelled against the Roman Empire in Jerusalem, and they were summarily dealt with, brutally dealt with. It was at that time that the temple was destroyed by the Romans and the Jewish population dispersed. Also at that time, the early disciples of Jesus refused to be part of the rebellion, and they incurred the wrath of their Jewish brothers and sisters because of that. We might mention in passing that pacifism was the default position for Christians in those early centuries. They had debates and discussions about whether one could be part of the Roman Empire and also a Roman army and also a Christian. But that's another issue for another time. So these early disciples, early Christians, for whom Matthew and the other gospel writers are writing, live in brutal times, times of great stress, great threat. If you were Jewish, and you were also a Christian, a follower of the way, as it was called in those days, you had every reason to live on a daily basis with fear. Your life was on the line. The stakes were high. Recall these words from Acts chapter 9. Meanwhile, Saul, later to be known as Saint Paul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found anyone who belonged to the way, man or woman, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And you can recall Stephen, the first Christian martyr. He is not done to death by the Romans, as Jesus was, but by his own brothers and sisters. So that the gospel today, which talks of decisions, commitment, having a focused mind, weighing up what matters, where your values are, where you take your stand, beyond which you are not willing to negotiate. These are times of great urgency, great pressure, very significant decisions. The stakes are high. Matthew describes how the 12 are given strict instructions and warned that they will be persecuted. In that context of a brutal, conflicted, convulsed society, these words make a lot more sense than they do as we look back with hindsight. Matthew writes, "See," has Jesus saying, "See, I'm sending you out like sheep in the midst of wolves. They will hand you over to councils and flog you in their synagogues. And you will be dragged before governors and kings because of me." These were real possibilities. In this kind of context, the mind must be focused on what matters. You can't be a bit of this and a bit of that, half-hearted. There is a sense of urgency. Priorities must be weighed up and chosen with great care. This gives more emphasis, more meaning, more perspective to those often quoted words of Jesus. Those who find their life will lose it. Those who lose their life for my sake will find it. In other words, if you find your life doing what you've normally done, giving in, not following the call of the Lord, you've lost your opportunity. But if you're willing to throw in your lot, be absolutely committed, you will find your life. The consequences might be severe. Always, this is the reality, potentially at least, lurking inside our baptism. What do you think?